All right, good evening, everyone. Erev Tov. Welcome to Echoes of Eden this evening as we are continuing our journey through the Torah in a year following those 54 divisions of the Torah. This week does bring us to a double portion, which is going to cover the 39th and 40th division of those 54 divisions, and it's quite a meaty double portion. Most double portions end up being, as you might imagine, two smaller portions, and it's not that big a deal, but both of these portions are filled with quite a bit of stuff. So it was very difficult trying to figure out what to talk about this evening, and so on that note, I would highly encourage you to listen to the archives for both CHUKAT and BALAK, as there are parts of them that I won't cover tonight that I have previously that are well worth the listen, including, for me, one of the most interesting jots or tittles in the text of the Torah, and a Torah scroll occurs in this week's double portion. But we won't cover really that this evening, as well as some of the intricacies. So as always, do consult some of the archives. Also, a couple of announcements for you. Next week, Monday, July 3rd, we will not be meeting. I will be out of town. I will be acting as the teaching dean at Camp Arcadia up north, where I'll be doing a week-long series of lectures there. But we will resume the following week on July 10th. However, not in this location because, God willing, they will be putting a new slate on the roof above. And while that technically shouldn't involve anything here below, it might mean the sides and stuff are kind of debris zones and so forth. So just to play everything safe, we'll be meeting in the Worship Center, and I'll try to remember to send out an email for that. So no class next week. We'll meet the following week in the Worship Center at 6:30. And then finally, want to remind you of the 2024 teaching tours that I will be doing. In June, there is a tour of Jordan and Israel with an option to extend that tour into Egypt, as well as in the first week of October of 2024, a trip to England and Scotland, and looking at kind of some of the Reformation and Christian heritage there in those two countries. Brochures are in the back. Also, anyone listening on the podcast or following online, you are welcome on those tours. 42 days from now, we go to Israel and Greece, and in that trip we have individuals from Montana, Texas, Kentucky, Indiana, Georgia, North Carolina, and of course Michigan. So very diverse group of people, so anyone is welcome to join those. All right, well, let's get started with the blessing before the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitishanu b'mitzvotav v'sivanu le'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments, and has commanded us to be immersed into the words and the matters of Torah. Amen. Well, since next week we won't be meeting, you'll get your fill this evening, all right? So we'll be here a while this evening, and that's with cutting a lot of things out, trimming the fat. As I said, this is a double portion this week. The portions, CHUKAT is the first of the two portions, followed by BALAK, which starts in Numbers chapter 19 and goes through the middle of Numbers chapter 25. So not only a lot of ground to cover just in page numbers and words, but a lot of stuff going on in the text itself, including a lot of messianic things, a lot of things certainly pointing to the Messiah, prophecies about the Messiah, shadows of the Messiah. Jesus quotes this week's portion in one of his more famous dialogues. In fact, the infamous John 3:16 is structured around this week's portion. And so just to kind of keep that in mind, John 3:16 kind of flows out of CHUKAT and BALAK this week. So a lot going on there. As I said, it's the 39th and 40th divisions of the Torah's 54. And kind of just summarizing things a little bit, that first portion, CHUKAT, it means a statute of the Torah, a law, an ordinance, a precept, different ways it gets translated. I think most of the time it gets translated as a statute. It's the plural of the Hebrew word hoch, which kind of is reserved for the commandments in the Torah that go beyond rational reason. Like, so, for instance, thou shalt not kill is not called a hoch. It's not one of the CHUKAT. Because that kind of makes sense, right? You don't necessarily feel that has to be divinely revealed to you that it's a bad thing to kill someone. However, taking the ashes of a red heifer and mixing it with water and then mixing it then with hyssop and crimson to have your sins forgiven or to have to be cleansed and have atonement, that doesn't quite follow the same rational thinking as thou shalt not steal. Right? Thou shalt not steal, again, kind of makes sense. But some of the, CHUKAT is kind of reserved for those supra-rational kind of commandments. That word occurs in Numbers 19, verse 2. And the second of the double portion, BALAK, refers to Balak, the king of Moab. Moab is modern-day Jordan. And Balak was king of Moab, and his name is found in the beginning of that portion, which is Numbers 22, verse 2. So what happens in these two portions? As I said, it's quite a bit, both in just actual length, but also the content itself. So Moses is first taught the laws of the red heifer, whose ashes purify a person who has been contaminated by contact with a dead body. And then after 40 years of journeying through the desert, the people of Israel arrive in what's known as the wilderness of Zin. And there Miriam, Moses' sister, dies, and the people thirst for water. That's an important connection that we actually won't delve into tonight. Again, the archives, I have delved into it. It's worth noting, though. They have water following them as long as Miriam is alive. When Miriam dies, their water dries up. And so there is an intimate connection between Miriam and water. Then, because they're obviously thirsty, the water is dried up for them. They complain to Moses. Moses intercedes to God. God tells Moses to speak to a rock and command it to give water. But Moses, in his anger at the rebellious Israelites and their constant groaning and whining and complaining, and nothing's ever good enough for them, in his anger, instead of speaking to the stone, he strikes the stone. It's very significant in the difference in those actions, and we'll unpack that a little bit when we get to being mindful of the portion. But nonetheless, water does issue forth, but Moses is told by God that neither he nor his brother Aaron will be able to enter into the promised land. Aaron then dies at a place called Hor Hahar, and he is succeeded in the high priesthood of the people by his son Eleazar. Venomous snakes then attack the Israelite camp, and another eruption of discontent among the people kind of come out. And it says, quote, they speak against God and Moses. And so God tells Moses to place a brass serpent on a high pole. Because of their discontent and their complaining, they begin to suffer from these venomous snake bites. God says, place a brass serpent on a high pole, and all who gaze heavenward will be healed. The people then sing a song in honor of a miraculous well that provided water in the desert. Moses leads the people in a battle against the Amorite kings of Sihon and Og. Moses simply wanted to travel through their territory, didn't want to do anything there, just wanted to have passage through. So when he sought permission and says, we won't take anything, we won't settle, we just want to, cut through your backyard, so to speak, they refused. And so as a result, Moses conquers their land, which lies east of the Jordan River. Balak, the king of Moab, then sees all of this. He gets a little bit nervous. So he summons the prophet Balaam. Won't go into it this class either, but have in the past. Worth your listen in the archives. Balaam is kind of the backside of Moses. Balaam is the Gentile Moses. That is, Balaam is imbued with all of the gifts and insight and connections that Moses is, except he is a Gentile. But Balaam kind of works on the dark side with all of that power, with all of that connection. And so Balak hires Balaam to curse the people because he knows Balaam has this ability to affect things spiritually. And so if Balaam curses you, you're going to really be cursed. If Balaam wants something, Balaam gets it. And so on the way to do this, Balaam is berated by his donkey, who sees the angel that God sends to block their way before Balaam does. And there's quite a bit going on there as well. It's also very much kind of echoing what you'll later see in the New Testament in the Gospel of Mark. And that is, you have Balaam, this spiritual giant, this spiritual guru, this wizard, if you will, this one who's supposed to be so in touch with all things spiritual. And you have this donkey, and yet it's the donkey who gets it. It's the donkey who sees the angel of the Lord. It's the donkey who understands what's going on, and not the one who really should have figured it all out. And so Balaam and his donkey kind of go at it. Three different vantage points. Balaam tries to curse the Israelites, but every time he goes to pronounce a curse, a blessing ends up coming out of his mouth. Balaam also prophesies at about the end of days, and he has one of the more significant prophecies about the Messiah, including that prophecy that the Messiah, when you're familiar with the story in Luke about the wise men seeing a star and following a star, that whole star prophecy comes from Balaam right here in this week's portion. That whole idea comes from this week's portion, as well as other things that Balaam says about the Messiah, who the Messiah will be, what the Messiah will do. So 3 times he tries to curse, 3 times he ends up blessing, and he also goes into prophecy related to the Messiah. The people then fall prey to the charms of the daughters of Moab and are enticed to worship the idol Peor. So what Balaam finally did was tell Balak, look, I can't do it. Like, I've already blessed them. You paid me to curse them. I ended up blessing them 3 times. You know what's going to work? What's going to work is sex. So you need to seduce their people. And the men will blindly follow your women. And then once they blindly follow your women, they will blindly follow their gods. And then you've got them. And that's exactly what they do. And that's exactly what the people do. And so they are enticed away by that and not by Balaam's curses. When a high-ranking Israelite official publicly takes a Midianite princess into his tent, so when someone very high up among the children of Israel begins to take a Midianite woman to be his, which means he's also going to follow her ways, there's an individual named Pinchas. Pincus. I think some English translations call him Phineas, but his name is Pincus, but you may see him in your Bible as Phineas. He kills both of these individuals, and he stops a plague that was raging among the people. And it is in that act that there is one of the most interesting graphical differences in the scroll of a Torah that it's involved in this act that Pincus does, that I would recommend you listen to the archives as well as find those handouts, which are all online, and look at that particular way the word shalom is spelt in the Torah in that certain area of Pincus and God making a covenant of peace with Pincus. Very significant act, very much foreshadowing the work of Messiah. So as I said, that's a lot going on in the portion. Any one of those could kind of keep our time here for the whole evening. And so with that said, let's kind of dive in. I thought first I would spend some time with the red heifer and connect it because it's a great shadow of Messiah. A lot of connections to our Messiah, the work of our Messiah, and I thought it would be worth us looking into. Also, hopefully, whether it's now or when we get to the being mindful part, you will begin to understand, while at first it's not rational, if you will, the whole ashes of the red heifer, if you really begin to ponder what's going on, there is some rationality to it that makes a lot of sense. And then in being mindful, I want to make us have that great connection with it. But I'll go ahead and give you a foretaste of it, because the more you can get it in your mind, the better it'll settle in when we get there. The great sin of this generation that's dying out, that will die out very soon as we're coming to the book of Deuteronomy and the end of the wilderness trip, and Joshua getting ready to take them into the promised land. The great sin of this generation that left Egypt, the Exodus generation, their great sin was the golden calf. That, we spent some time on it, and you could spend a whole lot more time on it. That was their fall. That was the equivalent of Adam and Eve's fall in the garden. It was major. Think about it. Golden what? Golden calf, right? You open up your first century toolbox and you look through there and you see Tikkun Olam, you see the repair of the world, you see whenever there's major cosmic breaches, there's always repairs. They're always linked. Sometimes it's more obvious than others. They're linked thematically. So you've got a sin of a golden calf, and now you have this one thing that brings purity and purifies and restoration, and it comes through the ashes of a red heifer. What did the calf and the heifer have in common? They're both cows, right? There's a very important connection on why it wasn't the ashes of a pigeon, or it wasn't the ashes of a goat, or it wasn't the ashes of a horse. It's related to part of the tikkun, the repair of the golden calf. Very significant connection there. All right? So keep that in mind, because we'll come back to it. But for now, let's look at the opening part of the portion. Numbers chapter 19, verse 2 says, "This is the statute," literally the CHUKAT, right? That's where the name of the portion comes from. "Of the law which the Lord commanded, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel, that they bring you an unblemished red heifer, in which is no defect, on which a yoke has never been placed." So it's got to be, and here's already some nice shadowing of the Messiah hovering over the text, road to Emmaus material. You have this sacrifice that essentially has to be without spot or blemish or defect. Right? Begins to sound familiar. So the Torah this week it again tells us the story kind of the death or the beginning of the death of that generation from Exodus that is going to perish in the wilderness because of the sin of the golden calf. But even in death, there is hope to be found ultimately through a coming one, an anointed one, a Messiah. Our hope is illustrated in the mysterious laws of the red heifer. According to the Levitical laws of clean and unclean, contact with a corpse renders a person unclean. The Torah says that simply being in the same room with a dead body is sufficient to make a person unclean. Walking over a grave, whether a person knows they've done so or not, makes a person unclean, which, by the way, gives you some insight into something Jesus says when he calls people whitewashed tombs. Why did he call them whitewashed tombs? You and I don't have whitewashed tombs, but even in Israel to this day, they put white paint, real quick white paint. Now sometimes it's blue if you're up in the northern part of Israel, but they do this over all the graves so that as you're walking through the land, you don't accidentally step over or come too close to a cemetery or a graveyard or a grave, especially as you get closer to Jerusalem, as pilgrims would be making their way to the temple. These graves would be painted white. That's what Jesus is referencing. And so walking over a grave even makes a person unclean. The Torah also teaches that the ritual uncleanness engendered by contact with a corpse is communicable. That means a person made unclean by death can make others unclean. In the legal terminology of the Talmud, the sages referred to a dead body as the father of uncleanness. In other words, it's the highest source of ritual impurity. Now, remember, when we talked about this in Leviticus, being unclean is not a sin. It's not wrong any more than going to work and getting dirty is wrong, or having dirt under your fingernails or grease on your shirt is wrong. It is not wrong. It's not a defect. It's not anything negative, nor is it a poor reflection on the person. The Torah regards attending to the dead, in fact, or escorting them to a burial as one of the greatest commandments you can observe. Uncleanness is relevant only in regard to entering the tabernacle or the temple, or eating or participating in the sacrifices. The Torah says in Numbers chapter 19, verse 13, anyone who touches a corpse, the body of a man who has died, and does not purify himself, defiles the tabernacle of the Lord. This is because God's sanctuary, the tabernacle, is supposed to be a place of life and not death. And so he forbids those polluted by death from entering. The sanctuary on earth is a reflection of the true sanctuary above, immortality. This teaches that before we can enter into God's eternal presence, we must transcend our mortal state. And before entering the heavenly temple, Jesus exchanged his mortal flesh for the immortal. And just as a person could not enter the tabernacle on earth until he had cleansed himself from the contamination of death, so we too cannot enter God's habitation until we leave our mortal flesh behind. Now, often it gets asked, well, what is this uncleanness related to death? I won't go into it a whole lot this evening. Check the archives because it's a good deep dive. But I will tell you in short, what makes death the ritual impurity, what death puts into us is doubt. It puts into us doubt and fear. That is its uncleanness. That is what is impure about it. And that is incredibly contagious. It's incredibly contagious. It makes us doubt. Specifically, it makes us doubt God's ability to resurrect the dead, because we think death has the final voice. We fear death. We avoid death at all costs. People will put off writing their last will and testament because they're so afraid if they do it, they'll die the next day, right? All kinds of superstition goes around death. It is the great fearmonger among humanity, whether you are Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, Jewish, or agnostic, or atheist. Everybody is scared out of their pants of death, and it causes a great doubt of God. The story I like to tell is a story of a teacher of mine. He was a rabbi, and he was on vacation. He was in Florida, and a member of his congregation called him and said, "My young son just passed away. It was a very unexpected, tragic death." And she said, "You need to come back here and resurrect him from the dead." And he was kind of caught off guard by that, as you might imagine. But she said, "You have talked about having faith in the resurrection, that God can do all things, and you speak about the immortality we have because of our relationship to God," and went on and on. She's like, "Come back and resurrect him from the dead." So he did go back. He immediately caught a flight, flew back, and I don't expect you to believe the story. I'm telling you the story, all right? Because the story is worth your pondering. He went in to see the family. The body of the young boy was still there, waiting for him to come resurrect him. So the rabbi leaned over and whispered in the young boy's ear, "I know you're not dead. I know you're not dead." And he said he heard as clear as day in that boy's voice, "Yeah, you know I'm not dead, and I know I'm not dead. But look at the faces of these people. They think I'm dead, and that's why I'm trapped." And that was their conversation. That's the impurity of death. Think about the book of Acts. It's loaded with miracles not done by Jesus, including raising people from the dead, not done by Jesus. Why? Why could they do it and we can't? Now, we can be dispensationalists, which is a horrible theology, but it does allow us to answer that question at least. It gets us into a whole lot of mess otherwhere, but it at least lets us say, "Oh, that was just so the apostles, they only had that so they could prove that they were the apostles. Oh, so the next generation didn't need to prove that they were the disciples of the apostles?" But it was only a dispensation that they could do that. No. You want to know why the church was doing miracles left and right? Because they believed. They believed it. They had absolute certainty, no doubt, and no fear. What do you think changed them after the resurrection? Read through the Gospels. They're bubbling buffoons running around the Galilee, getting everything constantly wrong. But after the resurrection, they're raising people from the dead. Why? Because they no longer fear and they no longer doubt. That is the great impurity of death. And the ashes of the red heifer purify one from that. That's its technology. Wouldn't it be great if we had that technology? We're going to find out we do. Right? It's the whole thing. Just because that's one way of getting the technology, it's not the only way of getting the technology. Where else does the technology of the red heifer exist? The book of Hebrews will tell us. We'll get there. Let's keep reading in the text. Numbers 19, verse 3. "You shall give it to Eleazar the priest, and it shall be brought outside the camp and be slaughtered in his presence." Speaking of the red heifer. Give it to the Eleazar the priest. He'll take it outside the camp. Very important phrase. "And be slaughtered in his presence." That's where they will do the sacrifice of the red heifer. A person can be cleansed from most forms of ritual impurity simply by means of an immersion in a mikveh, what we would most often associate with a baptism. They kind of go through the ritual waters, symbolizing being purified, and they're done. Ritual impurity caused by contact with death is much more serious, as we've just talked about. It can only be removed by the sprinkling of the water of the ashes of the red heifer, or the technology contained in the ashes of the red heifer. It's a strange ritual. The priesthood mixed the ashes of a burned red cow with large quantities of living water, fresh water. To be cleansed from corpse contamination, a person needed to be sprinkled with this ash and water mixture twice, on the third day and on the seventh day. And yeah, we'll talk about why the third and the seventh, and it's a beautiful foreshadowing of our Messiah. So the process took 7 days. The first sprinkling was applied on the third day of the purification process. The second sprinkling was applied on the seventh day of the process. The person undergoing purification then completed the ritual by immersing himself or herself in a mikveh. The Torah says that the sacrifice and burning of the red heifer had to take place outside the camp. Ordinarily, the Torah, God, prohibits sacrifices made outside of what it often would call the place that I have shown you, which means the tabernacle and eventually the temple. Sacrifices were not allowed outside of the tabernacle or the temple. They always had to be inside. Except the exception is the red heifer. It had to be slaughtered outside of the camp. In temple times, the entire city of Jerusalem was considered the camp, and the priesthood burned the sin offerings and the red heifer on the Mount of Olives outside the city walls, directly across from the Temple Mount. So if you've ever seen those pictures of Israel and you've seen the Golden Dome, if you go straight across from that onto the Mount of Olives, straight across, because there was a bridge connecting them, because that's where the Holy of Holies was, is where that Golden Dome is. Straight across the bridge, hit the center of the Mount of Olives. That's where the red heifer was sacrificed and the ashes gathered. If you go to Israel with me, I take you to that spot because there is a lovely, lovely little chapel there filled with all kinds of wonderful symbolism. The writer of the book of Hebrews sees in all of this a messianic foreshadowing and the fact that the red heifer was slaughtered and burned outside of the city and that the sin offerings were burned outside of the gates. So this is what Hebrews says. Hebrews 13, beginning in verse 11. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy place by the high priest as an offering for sin are burned outside the camp. Notice that phrase? That's a verbal tally. That's your Hebraic toolbox. That's your reference back to this week's portion of CHUKAT. All right? Burned outside of the camp. Therefore, Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people through his own blood, suffered outside the gate, outside the camp. So let us go out to him outside the camp, bearing reproach. Now, there's also a funny thing that goes on when they made the ashes of the red heifer. Notice the high priest was to do it, Eleazar. There was a priestly function. The priest had to be in a state of ceremonial purity to do this. So he was pure. But in the act of killing the red heifer and sacrificing outside of the tabernacle/temple, he becomes impure. But the effect of his work of going from pure to impure then allows those who are impure to become pure. So I'm going to repeat that. The function, part of the technology of the red heifer is that the pure priest becomes impure so that the impure people can have purity. That is the gospel of Jesus Christ, folks. The pure became impure so that the impure might become pure through his work. That is the technology of the red heifer. That is the technology of the passion of Jesus. Like the red heifer that was taken outside the city to be slaughtered and offered, Jesus was crucified also outside the camp, outside Jerusalem's walls. And the writer of the book of Hebrews takes the parallel even further. Just as the red heifer sacrifice was necessary to cleanse people from the contamination of death, right? And what is that again? It's fear. And this is where once we get into the seventh day part of this and then whole new creation and all that, what's going to remove our fear? It's going to be the resurrection, of course. But Jesus' death was necessary, the author of Hebrews concludes, to cleanse us from the same contamination. So again, from Hebrews. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling those who have been defiled, sanctify for the cleansing of the flesh, how much more would the blood of Messiah, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? We're going to keep going with the red heifer. Continue in Numbers 19, verse 19. Then the clean person shall sprinkle on the unclean on the third day. Can't hear a verbal tally with that phrase, on the third day, can we? And on the seventh day. And on the seventh day you shall purify him from uncleanness, and he shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and shall be clean by evening. A person made unclean by corpse contact must be sprinkled with the water of the ashes of the red heifer on the third day and the seventh day in a week-long process. There's a messianic significance on this third and seventh day in regard to the resurrection, which is the technology that removes from us all fear and doubt of death. On the third day, that phrase has always been through the prophets associated with resurrection. A quick glimpse at one verse for that. Hosea 6, verse 2. He will revive us after 2 days. He will raise us up, resurrect us literally, on the third day that we may live before him. The third day is significant in the measure of death, because it's on the third day after death that putrefaction of the corpses becomes obvious. This is why it's significant in the Gospels when Jesus makes it to Lazarus. They make the detail he's been dead for 4 days, because after 3, it's truly done. The leftover meat of the peace offerings, they were burned after the third day. And the sages taught that the soul abandoned the body on the third day. That's part of what they're doing with Lazarus. Like, his soul has left him, Lord. If you'd have been here just only a day sooner, his soul wouldn't have departed his body. The relevance of the third day after death explains why the ashes of the red heifer were sprinkled on that day. It also explains the importance of Messiah's resurrection on the third day. But why were they administered again on the seventh day? The seventh day anticipates the final redemption. 7 is the divine number, but it's also the number of redemption. The seventh-day Sabbath, the 7-day Sabbath, a foretaste of the Messianic age that commences with the resurrection. The high holidays in the fall, all of their rich resurrection allusions, are celebrated in the 7th month of the year. The millennial reign is referred to as the 7th millennium. Therefore, the sprinkling on the 3rd and the 7th days after contact with the corpse symbolize ultimate and final, complete and total victory over death. And so the disciples of the risen one, of the risen Messiah, have already seen the resurrection power of the third day that began the process of victory over death. And we await the resurrection of the final redemption to complete it. So that's some of the ashes of the red heifer and its very rich messianic significance. And that when you begin to kind of look into it and look at the code of the technology that makes up the ashes of the red heifer, you see that that same code and that same technology is found in the death and resurrection of Jesus, including the specific language related to the red heifer. That same language is used of Jesus, his death and his resurrection, very vividly. So CHUKAT, this week's portion, the gospel writers knew it very well. And they quote its language, and as we saw in Hebrews, they apply it directly to Messiah. Now I want to shift to another part of our double portion that is also rich in kind of messianic overtones. The serpent on the pole. So Numbers 21, verse 8, it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent and set it on a standard." We're going to unpack that word standard or pole. We're going to find a different meaning of that word in the FIV. "And it shall come about that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it," that is the serpent up on this standard, on this pole, "he will live." Okay, so again, some miracle technology, spiritual technology going here. People are experiencing a plague of death caused by the bite of a snake. Can we think of any symbolism there of a serpent getting its fangs into some human being and then death plaguing everybody because of that serpent's bite? Maybe there's something in Genesis related to that, right? And yet the technology to overcome it is to look up to a pole and look up to the object on the pole and see that object, and then you will live and not die. So after the death of Moses' sister Miriam, the rock no longer followed Israel as they left the wilderness and entered into the area of Edom. And so in Numbers 21, verse 5, the people get anxious and they protest and they say, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There's no food, there's no water. We loathe this miserable food." You catch that? That sounds a lot like your kids, right? There's no food. This food stinks. Wait, I thought there was no food, right? That's the whole, "I'm starving, there's nothing to eat in the house." And they have their refrigerator open and it's filled with probably now thousands of dollars of your food. "I'm starving, there's nothing to eat. What are you doing to me?" And so the Lord chastened them, but it's an improper connection. And poisonous serpents were the result. The venom began killing many of the people and made others ill. And the people quickly repented and they turned to Moses for reprieve. And they said this in Numbers 21, verse 7, "We have sinned because we have spoken against the Lord and you. Intercede with the Lord," they said to Moses, "that he may remove the serpents from us." And Moses did that. Moses was the man, the mediator between God and the people. And the Lord instructed him to make a bronze serpent. We're going to go with bronze or copper, but it's not that. Listen to the archives. He was set it atop a pole. It's not a pole or standard. We will get to that tonight. When those who were suffering the effects of the venom looked at the serpent, they were cured. Again, it says in the text, Numbers 21:9, "If a serpent bit any man, any person, when he looked to the bronze serpent, he lived." A strange story. But fortunately, Jesus himself interprets it for us. In his conversation with a man named Nicodemus, and probably the most popular known chapter of the entire Bible, John chapter 3, verses 14 through 17, including that infamous 16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. That verse is given in the context of this portion in the book of Numbers. Jesus there says these words, "As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up." What does the term lifted up mean in this context? It has at least two meanings. We will explore two of them this evening. The first refers to his death. Jesus uses the term lifted up from the earth in John 12, verse 32, as a reference to his crucifixion. John explains in John 12, verse 33, he was saying this to indicate the type of death by which he was to die. His body was to be lifted up on a cross, similar to the way Moses lifted up the bronze serpent on a standard. When we understand the bronze serpent is foreshadowing the Messiah's crucifixion, the passage becomes alive. Like the people in the wilderness, you and I have sinned against the Lord. And similarly, we have been bitten by a serpent, by the Satan. His spiritual venom courses through our flesh, and it's killing us. It's already killed many of us, and others, and the rest of us are ill and dying. We are all under a death sentence. And like the people in the wilderness, we need to confess our sin, and we need to repent, and we need to go to the man that is between us and God himself. We must look at the death of Messiah for our healing. How did the serpent on the pole heal the people? The sages explain and have always explained that it wasn't so much the serpent on the pole, it was faith in God and obedience to his command that resulted in their healing. It wasn't a magical thing. So from the Mishnah Rosh Hashanah, chapter 3, Mishnah teaching 8. Did the bronze serpent kill or give life? Of course not. Rather, when the people of Israel lifted up their eyes toward heaven and submitted to their Father in heaven, they were healed. If not, they would pine away. And so, when we look to Jesus' death for our salvation, what we're really doing is placing our trust in our Father in heaven, and from his grace that comes to us through the Son that was lifted up. But let's keep looking at this a little deeper. Moses says this, looking Numbers 21, verse 9. Moses made a bronze serpent, set it on the standard, and it came about if a serpent bit any man. When he looked to the bronze serpent, he lived. When Jesus said, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so the Son of Man must be lifted up, John 3:14. He was, as we talked about, hinting at the type of death he would die, being lifted up on a cross, for sure. But there's a second meaning as well. Jesus was speaking not only of his death, but also of his ascension 40 days after the resurrection. God told Moses, make a fiery serpent and set it on a standard, verse 8. A standard is a pole which an emblem is displayed. The Hebrew word being translated as pole or standard is nes. And nes is also the same word for miracle. It's also the same word for miracle. One of the things I'll talk about next week as the teaching dean at Arcadia is the fact that the Hebrew language is word poor. And so every Hebrew word is pregnant with layers and layers of meaning. Nes is one of those very pregnant words. Does it mean pole or standard? Sure, it does. Find plenty of examples where it means that. But it also means miracle. And there's a reason why, and come to Arcadia next week and I'll tell you, all right? But it means miracle as well. So, we could translate this passage to say this: and you get an A+ on your Hebrew test. Make a fiery serpent and set it up, lift it up on a miracle. Now, that sounds like a really goofy translation, and that's why your translators don't translate it that way. But I think that's where the meaning is. And so have the sages of Israel always thought that. They have always emphasized the miracle meaning of nes. Moses was supposed to set the serpent upon this nes. And they explained that Moses set the serpent on the miracle. What he did was he tossed it into the air where it stayed hovering above the ground so that all Israel could look at it. Because the text says they looked upward, they looked heavenward, so that Moses kind of took this serpent on a pole and kind of chunked it up in the air, and then it kind of rotated him high above them in the air. Very reminiscent, of an ascension. Okay? In fact, this is in Midrash Bamidbar. The Midrash Rabbah, it says this. And Moses made a bronze serpent and put it on the miracle. That means he cast it into the air and it stayed there. The Torah does not imply that the serpent levitated in the air, not in a direct way, but the explanation fits well. In other words, this tradition that you're seeing up on your screen, Jesus knew that tradition. The apostles knew that tradition. The first century Galilean Jewish community knew that tradition. That's what they were taught. And so Jesus' words come from that tradition. And it gives very vivid words to Jesus' words in John 3. Jesus was explaining to Nicodemus that the Son of Man must be lifted up. Not just lifted up on a cross, yes and amen to that. Absolutely. But also, he says this to Nicodemus. No one has ascended into heaven, but he who descended from heaven, the Son of Man. So you notice Jesus actually uses the word ascension in this conversation. In a similar passage, Jesus told the Galileans that he descended from heaven. And when they objected, he replied in John 6, verse 61, does this cause you to stumble? What are you going to do when you see the Son of Man ascend as none has before? In John 3, Jesus tells Nicodemus that no one has ascended to heaven, but he will, because he is the one who has descended from heaven. And that's when he says in the very next verse, after he tells Nicodemus, no one has ever ascended to heaven, but you will see me because I've descended. And then he says, and just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, i.e., ascended. In this context, the primary meaning of his words point toward his ascension. It is the ascension of Jesus, his return to his former glory, the former station he had with his Father that holds the promise of salvation for all who believe. When Jesus ascended, he rose from the ground on the strength of a miracle, of a nes. See the connection there? He was lifted up on a nes, just as Moses supposedly tossed the serpent into the air, and there it remained for all to look upon it for salvation. So too, the Son of Man has ascended and remains lifted up. He remains lifted up for the salvation of all who will look to him. So Jesus refers both to the cross and to the ascension when he says, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. The lifting of the Son of Man upon the nes is the means by which the lifting of the Son of Man through the miracle of the ascension occurred. And then some kind of final words that kind of will hint at, just so you're aware of this great messianic prophecy, and it comes from the portion, of the double portion from Balak. I wanted to make sure we at least got into that a little bit. We've been in CHUKAT all evening so far. I just wanted you to be very aware of this prophecy, even though we won't go great in depth to it. But as I said earlier, it's the origin. This is the origin of a star coming before the birth of Messiah. This is the origin of it. Okay? Numbers 24:17. This is Balaam, the Gentile Sith Lord of King Balak. And he has entered into a prophetic mode, right? It's almost as if God took control of him, because every time he wanted to curse, he blessed. And then all of a sudden, when he looks out and he sees Israel scattered in the land, he enters into a prophetic mode and he says this: I see him, but not now. He sees a person in the future. I behold him, but he's not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab. Oh, that's Genesis 3:15 language, folks, crushing the head. It's Messiah all over the place. And break down all the sons of Sheth. This is a heavily messianic passage, and I'm going to show you some proof from some sources that existed before Jesus' earthly ministry that this has always been understood to be about the Messiah. So as I said, Balaam, again, the Sith Lord, if you will, the one who possesses the force but doesn't use it for light. He foresaw the coming of the king of Israel, a certain king of Israel coming and utterly defeating all the enemies of Israel, crushing Moab, subduing Edom and all of humanity. That's what the sons of Seth is code for, by the way. One from Jacob shall have dominion, he says, Numbers 24, verse 19. Balaam declared this, and the Targum Yonatan paraphrases these passages to speak of King Messiah, and the Targum Onkelos also does it and even brings it into the end times and the war of Gog and Magog and Armageddon. So what are the Targums? It's been a while since we've talked about our friend the Targums. What are the Targums? The Targums are those Aramaic paraphrases, not translations, Aramaic paraphrases / interpretations of the Torah. And so there became a point where many of the Jews were in diaspora. They were scattered about the land and scattered outside of the land of Israel. And when they would gather and worship in their synagogues, they would still read the Torah every week in the Hebrew. But it would be like, for a lot of them, me reading the Bible in Latin. And so then someone would come up and summarize what the passage in the Torah that was read in the language you no longer understand, they put it in your language. And so when they would do this, they added some interpretation, a little bit of shifting things around, because their job was just to kind of tell you what it was and what it was about. This gets codified, meaning written down. And this becomes then a normal practice in the synagogue. You read a portion from the Torah, and then you hear the Targum beside it. These existed before the earthly ministry of Jesus, which means Jesus growing up, the apostles growing up, the disciples growing up, everyone who's first century growing up has heard these interpretations of the Torah. It is your first study Bible of the Torah. That's why it's so important. It was Jesus' study Bible. Jesus had a study Bible. It was called the Targums. So what do the Targums say of Numbers 24, verse 17? This is from Targum Yonatan. I'll read it to you. So imagine I've just spoken in a language you don't understand, and you're like, could you please explain Numbers 24:17 in English, please? I said, sure. This was what was just read. Right? That's the real thing. Now listen to what you hear in your language. I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but he is not near. So far, so good, right? When the mighty king of Jacob's house shall reign, and the Messiah, who is the powerful scepter of Israel, will be anointed, He will slay all the princes of the Moabites and bring to nothing all the children of Seth, even the armies of Gog, which is Armageddon, who will do battle against Israel, and all of their carcasses will fall before him. This is Revelation stuff, folks. The Targum Onkelos. So you have Targum Yonatan and you have Targum Onkelos. Read to you Numbers 24:17 in a language you don't understand. Pastor, can you put that in English for me? Sure. I shall see him, but not now. I behold him, but he is not nigh. So far, so good. When a king shall arise out of Jacob, the Messiah will then be anointed from Israel, and he will slay the princes of Moab and reign over all the children of men. And Edom shall become his inheritance, and Seir a possession of Edom's adversaries. So Jesus' study Bible told him Numbers 24:17 was all about the Messiah. And the Targums are unanimous in ascribing this prophecy to the era of the Messiah's ultimate coming, what we would call his second coming. The great theologian of the Jewish people, Maimonides, the Rambam, took a more complex approach to the prophecy. He reasoned that some of the prophecy, particularly the passage relating to the conquest of Moab and Edom, could be attributed to King David. And he pointed out that David was also an anointed, a Mashiach of Israel, and therefore a kind of a junior Messiah, a foreshadowing of the Messiah. And so he sees it as referring first to King David, finding its first fulfillment in King David, and its ultimate fulfillment in Messiah. So this is the Rambam's commentary in what's known as the Mishneh Torah. Even in this section, Balaam, it is said, and there he prophesied about two Messiahs. About the first Messiah, who was David, who saved Israel from the hands of its enemies, and about the final Messiah, who will arise from David's children and will come to save Israel at the end of days. And there he says in Numbers 24:17, I see him, but not now. This refers to David. I behold him, but he's not near. This refers to the King Messiah at the end of ages. So just wanted to throw that out from Balak. It's a very, very heavy messianic prophecy in the book of Numbers. It's also, again, the origin of the messianic star. And finally, we will conclude this evening with being mindful of CHUKAT. We're not going to do Balak because I don't want to keep you all night. So we're going to do CHUKAT. So what I want to do here is, what we try to do in these mindful sessions is, how can I take this spiritual technology that seems so distant and ancient and far away, like burning a perfectly red heifer and being purified, and what's that mean for me in my journey now? Right? So that's where we're going to go. We'll delve a little bit into Miriam and her death and her connection to water and what that means for us as well. So during our Torah journey, as we are in Bamidbar, in the midst of the wilderness, as we are trekking along, and we've been doing it for a very long time now. And this week, both Miriam and Aaron will die. The Torah portion, CHUKAT, prepares us by beginning with a ritual that purifies us at those times when we come into contact with death. It is one of the most mysterious and powerful rituals in the entire Torah. The great blessing of the portion CHUKAT is the knowledge that whatever our defilement, whatever our mistakes, we can always return to our essential purity, that God always provides a means to purify us. Whenever I seek to learn from mistakes that I've made, I usually try to look for a pattern and then try to understand the source of that pattern. It is understood from the Torah tradition that the quintessential mistake of our spiritual ancestors as they wandered through the wilderness was none other than the sin of the golden calf. This portion begins by discussing the great ritual for purification. The first and major ingredient required for this ritual is the red heifer. The heifer is a mother cow that has never been yoked. To know the source of sin, I must lay the red heifer on the fires of truth. Because she is the mother of the golden calf, which is the source for the pattern of my sin, her ashes are the first ingredients that I will need for my purification. On these fires of truth, I will also place just the right amounts of pride and humility, represented in our Torah portion by the tall cedar and the low-growing hyssop. Cedar and hyssop were part of this mixture of the ashes of the red heifer. That represents my pride, the tall cedar of Lebanon, and it represents my humility, the low-growing hyssop. Because I will need both pride and humility in order to accompany me on my journey of purification. Pride allows me to stand tall enough to see the path ahead. Humility connects me to the earth beneath my feet. The last element the Torah requires for the ritual is crimson, which is my passion, which adds my own holy fire to the fires of purification. And so the recipe, the spiritual recipe, includes insight, pride, humility, passion, mixed with living waters, which is the compassionate flow of life, combining to provide the perfect alchemical formula for our renewal. The golden calf is built when we lose faith in the invisible, unnameable God who seemingly has abandoned us to die in the wilderness. When we begin to doubt and when we begin to fear, we begin erecting our golden calf. And we are tempted to build a life around this golden calf, thereby placing something other than the God-essential mystery at the center of our attention. That life built around the worship of security or happiness or wealth or fame obscures the root fear of death that has unconsciously been driving us. When we are ready to identify our golden calf, then we must trace its roots and find its mother, the red heifer. The impetus for our own idolatry, the clue to our own pattern of sin. And then we're able to offer up the ashes of the red heifer, the insight into the nature of our root fear. When death touches our lives, we can be protected from our own tendency towards fear by the blessing of this insight. And having placed our fear and faced it, we need not live in its shadow anymore. This week's portion tells of Miriam's death, and immediately afterward, the text notes that the people are thirsty. Their thirst drains them of strength for the journey and fills them with despair and doubt. And so they complain to Moses and Aaron, who ask God to help. God tells Miriam's grieving brothers to speak to the rock before the assembled community, promising that it will yield water for everyone. But Moses doesn't just speak, he speaks sharply to the thirsty masses, and then he hits the rock twice instead of speaking to it. Miriam had a way with water. She could touch the depths of her song and call forth the spiritual nourishment. No matter how difficult the journey, Miriam's song, her dance, would bring ease and beauty. She carried with her the feminine wisdom that could not be written down. Upon her death, we are given a spiritual challenge to reclaim the source of her wisdom, to discover her song in our voice and her dance in our step. Moses was given this challenge, but he failed it. But he failed it in order that we might learn from his mistake, as the Apostle Paul tells those in Corinth. Our spiritual ancestors did what they did as examples for us, including their mistakes. Moses blamed the thirsty people for their complaint and then took the credit for the life-giving power that was God's alone. When he struck the rock twice, it did pour forth water, but it exacted a great price. Until we learn to speak to the rock, we also will be denied entrance to the land of promise. You see, to speak to the rock means to be in conversation. To hit the rock is an attempt to subjugate. Miriam knew the words and she knew the music that would open the deep and secret places that would gush forth water. The spiritual challenge of CHUKAT is to call Miriam's wisdom back to us, to reopen the conversation with the rock, to converse with it, not to subjugate it. We will close there this evening. Hopefully that gives you some insight into the mysterious nature of the ashes of the red heifer. And you see underneath it, it has a logic all its own that makes pretty good sense. No class next week. 2 weeks from now, the worship center. Let's close with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. Blessed are you, Lord God, who has given to us the gift of the Torah. Amen. Shalom, shalom, and Selah.